Hey, Presales Collective, it's your host, James Kakis, and today I'm going to be joined by Piet Saegeman, solopreneur, founder, and messaging strategist at Yamazoni. The topic of today's episode is strategic messaging. Piet and I actually go back to 2016 when Piet was the head of product marketing and I was leading the sales engineering team at Showpad. And so we worked very closely together because at the time we were still in startup mode and probably under 200 or 250 employees. So everything that marketing was doing was being translated in the field by the sales team. And I felt like our sales engineering team was really at the crux of what was working in the field and what was not working in the field. So Piet and I worked very closely together, and I really learned the importance of messaging in the early days at Showpad. And actually, fast forward to the Presales Collective, we've done so many exercises around messaging, some of those with Piet. And so the importance of messaging, not just from a sales engineering perspective, but from a professional perspective. The importance of messaging, not just to solutions engineers in the field, but to the profession and to a professional community is really, really important. So today's episode, we're going to unpack what messaging actually is, why it's important, and how pre-sales professionals can really play a pivotal role within their organization as it relates to messaging. Enjoy.
Vivint offers a way for companies to deliver an incredible buyer experience, with pre-sales leading the charge. With Vivint, companies can meet the demanding needs of the sales-proof buyer by aligning sales with product, providing repeatable workflows, delivering on-demand product expertise, and winning more deals with transparency and trust. For more information, visit vivint.com.
Piet, welcome to the Presales Podcast. How are you, sir?
I'm very good. Thanks for having me.
This is the fun part about leading a podcast and having Presales Collective is people that I've known and worked with in the past and seeing things kind of come full circle 5-10 years later, because you and I worked together at Showpad where you were the head of product marketing. And I can remember multiple stories, but many times where we've just sat in a room and we're discussing positioning and messaging and what would resonate, what wouldn't resonate. And here we are 7 years later recording a podcast on messaging on the Presales Podcast. So it's pretty cool. With Presales Collective, there's a lot of things that happen behind the scenes. And when we were starting Presales Leadership Collective, I reached out to you and said, hey, we need a little bit of help because we were trying to figure out how we position Leadership Collective, how we should be looking at our value drivers, how we make sure that this sub-community makes an impact. And we went through an exercise together, which was pretty fun. So that was about a year and a half ago now. So it's great to see, again, this come full circle as well.
I remember that was the very beginning, right? It's amazing how far you guys have come in the last year and a half.
It is. And we appreciate your help on that. It's allowed me to look at things differently as not just a pre-sales professional, but a community leader, an entrepreneur, a co-founder. So I'm excited to talk about messaging because messaging is extremely important to us at Presales Collective. There's so much happening in this profession. It's good for us to make sure that we're tight and aligned in our approach. But then I reflect back to my pre-sales days and thinking about what was happening in marketing, what was happening in sales, what was actually happening in the field. So discussing messaging and its impact for pre-sales professionals is something that I'm excited to dive into. Before we get there though, Piet, talk to us about your career journey. What got you to where you are today?
Oh, wow. Well, for me, there's no real functional line in my career. I've done many different things. I started out in technical roles in the graphics industry, like not design, production. So really scientific and technical stuff. Moved into pre-sales, then moved into sales, then went to Apple, did some business development there, product marketing at Showpad, and then marketing at various startups. For me, pre-sales was the gateway drug. I came from a technical role and I was one of these people who said, I could never do sales. Well, guess what? Everything is sales. And once you go into pre-sales, to me, it was like university because you get to work with some really seasoned individuals. And if you just listen and keep your mouth shut at the right moment, it's like the best education you'll ever get. Just seeing these people work, it made me comfortable sitting at a table and being part of a negotiation from a technical background. And you learn from some really good people. So it got me from technical roles into my first business roles. So that was pretty much how that went in the last 15, 20 years, something like that.
I love that. And I always appreciate that about you because I feel like you had a well-rounded perspective. No offense to any marketing folks or any sales folks out there, but sometimes when people have been working in the line of business forever, they sometimes have a certain opinion on how things have gone. And I think your technical background and pre-sales background allowed you to always have a really good stance as a product marketer. So I always appreciated that. So let's get into today's topic of strategic messaging. Pete, let's just start with the why. For you as a business owner and entrepreneur, why did you decide to focus on messaging in particular?
First of all, I liked it a lot. Like the things you talked about, we did a couple of years ago, just shaping the way people talk about a product or an organization is really interesting. But if you look at all the jobs I did before and all the roles I held before, basically I started doing it out of frustration. I was just annoyed that in so many organizations, messaging is a failure point. So you have some simplistic approaches. You've maybe got like a 200-word blurb or a 200-slide presentation that's supposed to be your messaging, but it doesn't really cut the mustard. And I realized that messaging has a huge impact. I remember at Showpad, when we built the messaging, we shared the document. We had this content analytics so we could see how well content was doing. And the content on our messaging became the most used and most shared piece of content in the history of the company within a week. It goes to show that there's just a lot of demand there and there's a huge impact. So it ties everything together and it can take an organization to the next level. What's really interesting is that messaging is almost like the last step. If you start with a small organization and there is no control over messaging, so marketing says one thing, whatever they need to say to reach their metric, then sales says something completely different, whatever it takes to close the deal. And then customer success goes, they sold you what? And they then say, well, here's what you actually bought. And then you get a bunch of feature requests and churn. So what does an organization do? They say, well, we need pre-sales. They get pre-sales in, and pre-sales is seen as the voice of reason because the customer knows that marketing says whatever and sales says whatever. And then the first time they really talk to somebody that's going to tell them the truth, the objective truth, is pre-sales. And they then align with customer success. Wouldn't it be great if an organization would align itself on this common narrative from the start and have all the stakeholders, so pre-sales, product marketing, all the customer-facing roles basically just unite and get a consensus over what the story is and what we're going to say about ourselves. That's the power of messaging. It makes pre-sales less a crutch or a way to fix things, and it makes pre-sales like a core of that whole messaging thing that marketing and sales are going to base themselves on.
I want to actually come back to that a little bit in terms of relevant examples from my experience in the field. But I want to highlight something with Presales Collective is that there's so much noise out there generally. Cutting through the noise is really, really tough. And when we talk about this pre-sales profession, this term pre-sales, in my opinion, doesn't even really capture what this role of solutions engineering or solutions consulting actually is. And even when you think about messaging of a profession, we're all over the place. I get this debate with people. They're like, well, the title should be this and the title should be that. And some people say it doesn't matter what the title is. And while I would agree with you in the day-to-day of an organization, if you think about moving a profession forward, the profession needs to have aligned messaging on what the role is. You see people come into this profession and say, oh, it's sales engineering. I don't want to be in sales. I'm not an engineer, right? And they're like, oh, I don't want to find out what that is, right? When they learn that it's a customer-centric problem solver. It's the best job out there that no one's ever heard of, right? That we're continuing to change. But it has changed my perspective on how messaging even affects a profession, from the top levels all the way down through an organization. I kind of want to pick apart this concept of messaging with you a little bit. How would you define messaging? In your own words, what is messaging?
Well, it's basically for an organization or for a profession, it's everything you say about yourself. It's what marketing says to engage an audience. It's what sales says to convince prospects. It's what CS or customer success says to retain customers. And it becomes a key component of your brand. It's defining who you are as a company or as a pre-sales professional, right? And it becomes a foundation to your communication. Because in the examples that you mentioned, the sales engineer, all of a sudden, once you start using the word sales, you have all of the stigma and all of the preconceptions that come with that, and they will basically pollute the definition of the role. I always say you have to have a very clear definition because, as you mentioned, we're swamped with information, right? And our brain is not built for the amounts of information it needs to process these days. So it's really good at filtering out stuff. And I think that's where a lot of initiatives and companies make a mistake. They think that our customer is just sitting around waiting for us to call and say, oh, thank God you're here. Tell me something about yourself. They don't care. You have to see it as more like they're on a rodeo. They're on a wild horse hanging on for dear life. Failure will be public and there's probably clowns. That's what you have to cut through. That's what you have to cut through as a professional positioning a product or a role for customers. So that'll be a long-winded definition of messaging is really, it's everything you say about yourself.
It's super interesting that you say that. And one of the things that we've talked about before too is this concept of even tone in messaging. Do you have a perspective on how tone actually plays a role when it comes to messaging?
In my opinion, a brand has three main components. The component that we know best is the visual component. It has a clear deliverable. That's your brand identity guideline, and it's owned by designers, right? Then you have tone of voice, right? Tone of voice has a deliverable. That's your style guide. I remember the one Danielle at Chopad wrote was a very, very good one. That's how you sound. Like, do you sound optimistic or serious or dependable, and what kind of words you use? And the third component is messaging. That's what you say. And that's the one that's always missing. So those three components together, you need all three to have a good brand.
Again, I'm like sitting here reflecting pre-sales role, pre-sales collective, how this all works together. But let's maybe talk about organizationally, because I want to talk about messaging's impact on like pre-sales and tying that gap in the field. So when a marketing team is approaching a messaging exercise, what does that exercise look like and how does it actually work?
The first thing you do is you kind of step back a little bit. A lot of organizations have a problem, I call it funnel vision, where they've adopted a number of methodologies and a number of tools often, and that is going to define what they say to the market at which point. And it's all optimized to hit their metrics, which is great. But what you really should be doing is looking at it from the standpoint of your potential customer and say, okay, what do I need to say? And the way I approach that is you look at the buyer journey. And the buyer journey starts from, I'm blissfully unaware. I don't know you exist. I don't know I have a problem, right? I don't know what my pains are. You hear everybody talking about pains, but nobody knows what their pains are. Porsche doesn't market its cars to people that are habitually late. So pain-based marketing is very one-sided. So you have this one end of the buyer journey where people are blissfully unaware, and the other extreme of the buyer journey at the end where they go, okay, where do I sign? Throughout the buyer journey, people have predictable informational needs. They'll want to know things like why change, or what is this? How does it work? Why should I pick you over some other solution? Can I trust you? And what needs to happen? And why does it have to happen now? If you answer all of those questions, then you've got messaging. And what's really important is that everybody answers those questions in the same way, so that the story that the customer hears from marketing at the beginning, top of funnel, is the same story, the same. We create urgency in the same way. We define the product in the same way. We articulate value in the same way. Once you do that consistently, you'll notice that your time to sell shortens dramatically.
I agree with you. When everyone is saying the same thing, it can resonate. And let me really peel back some layers with Presales Collective. I have this philosophy that if we are all, when I say we, I'm talking about the profession, our ambassador program, our PSLC members. If we're talking about critical things that matter to the profession and to elevating this profession, I'd like everyone to be saying similar things. And I'm not saying, hey, this is what you need to say, but us capturing people's opinions, formulating a statement and making that statement be known on, hey, this is what the role should be called. This is how you should handle KPIs with a little bit of shifts. And this is my example. If you were in an arena or a sports stadium and you're the home team and there's a chant happening in that stadium, okay? If everyone in that stadium, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, whatever 1,000 people are saying the same thing, that is palpable. The players could hear that. The players could feel that. But if everyone is in their own sections, chanting their own different thing, it just feels like noise at the end of the day. And that's kind of how I feel like our profession traditionally has approached sales engineering. So for us, I do think that we need to have some commonalities in how we talk about it so that pre-sales can get its strategic seat at the executive table when it comes to sales and marketing, go-to-marketing organizations. Okay, that's my pre-sales collective spiel. But when I think about back in the day, when I think about connecting product marketing to the sales and pre-sales being involved, I feel like there's always been a disconnect, right? Marketing puts out messaging that they believe is right based off customer research, client research, and then the salespeople will take that and spin it in their own way. And then pre-sales kind of comes in and is in the middle ground. So that disconnect has always existed. In your opinion, why does it have to always exist? Why do the sales folks have to say their marketing, they don't necessarily get what resonates? We have to spin it to make it resonate with customers. Because to your point, that potentially slow down the sales cycle.
There's a couple of components to that. On the one hand, there is the technical component, which is attribution and metrics. You'll do what needs to happen to reach your metrics, and all the rest be damned, but I'm going to hit my metric, because you have a very small window of opportunity to demonstrate value to the company and make your next promotion or make your next step in your career. So that's one thing. But the other thing is a bit deeper. The other thing is more an issue with our brains. We like tribes. So there's a lot of tribalism. And I think the challenge is that we've always had these silos or tribes within a company. And you'll have people that say in marketing, that say, oh, I could never do sales. Sales are such and such people. I could never do that. And my first question is, why the hell are you in marketing, right? So that tribalism is there. And I think what needs to happen is for people to align to a common story and supersede the metric-based thinking and see the bigger picture. Like, what are you trying to do in the world, and align to that. What also helps is if you look at these chants that happen in these stadiums, they have a number of commonalities, right? First, you have a very strong tribal connection. This is your team, and whatever they say goes. Second is these messages are insanely short and very easy to reproduce. So if you have something that you want to start being picked up by more people, make it easier to reproduce. The idea that is easiest to reproduce will gain the most traction in the long run. And if people can identify to that movement, so instead of saying, well, we need a stronger pre-sales movement, why not say, well, we need a more unified approach to business in general. We need to get everybody on board. From what I've seen, I think pre-sales and product marketing are probably the two functions that are best placed to own this in a larger company.
Piet, that actually just blew my mind. I love how you broke down my sports analogy and example and just distilled that into messaging. That made a lot of sense to me. I love that. Let's focus on like the startup scale-up world. Product marketing and pre-sales folks are really tied together. I've always felt like in my career, I was pretty much part product marketing, part sales, just based off being in that role that kind of hinges and bridges between both groups of marketing and sales. So how can a pre-sales professional go about trying to unify the messaging journey from what they're hearing in marketing, what salespeople are saying in the field, and then what customers are actually resonating and responding to?
That's a tough question, because from experience, so pre-sales professionals are diplomats. They're peacekeepers and very, very good negotiators. So they can keep the peace between warring factions in a company. What I think needs to happen is that it needs to go up a level, because what you're doing is you're trying to fix a company-wide issue, which is this silo-based variance in messaging and people doing their own thing. And you can't fix that from the same level where the problem originates. So one of the key things that I say when I start a project is I check, is leadership on board with this? Who's going to own messaging? Because right now, messaging is owned a little bit everywhere. You need a multidisciplinary team to own messaging, and it needs to have stakeholders from pretty much every role there. That only works if you can talk to leadership and say, listen, is it okay if we spend a little time with all these people to build this messaging and to start curating this? Because that's not going to be on a marketing only to-do list or on a sales only to-do list. It's going to be on a company-wide to-do list, and people from various functions are going to have to help out a little bit. My advice there would be is, don't try and fix it from within the process, but talk to leadership and say, listen, for what we see, here are the points where we see our messaging failing. Here's where pre-sales has to reiterate messaging because it's incorrect or because it doesn't resonate. Here's where we have to redo this thing. Let's see if we can get everybody on the same page. And that usually makes a difference. And that's also a failure point. So if management says we're not involved, or let marketing fix it and only marketing, that's a huge red flag, because then you're just moving the problem around.
This has me thinking, an organization maybe comes to market with a product and they've essentially had a small founding team or small extended team for 5, 6, 7 years. And like you said, the product kind of remains the same, but all of a sudden they've kind of figured out a light bulb and found product market fit, and the messaging's resonating and the organization takes off. What does that exercise look like? How does an organization start to figure out, okay, this is what's resonating with my audience. I need to double down and move forward on that?
There's an art and a craft to it. The first reaction you'll get from marketing is, let's test it. Let's A/B test it. And I often say, well, with your visitor numbers, you're not going to have any statistically representative information, so why bother? But you want to test everything, that's great. But it's okay to have a strong opinion. And the companies that have the strongest opinion usually thrive. If you're only going to say what the market expects you to say and solve the problem that you know exists from your product market fit exercise, you're not going to go far. If you have a strong opinion, that's more likely to resonate. So where do you get the information to build messaging, right? So first off, you can't do it quickly. You need to have multiple iterations. People have their best ideas, like when they're brushing their teeth, taking a shower, or on the toilet. And you need to give them that space. I always say never do 2 sessions in a row if there's no weekend in between, because the weekends are when you have these big insights. When you're going for a run or you're going for a walk or you're taking, all of a sudden you got poof, and the next week you've got new stuff. So it takes a while to iterate. I remember at Showpad, it took a couple of months actually. And then you have a bunch of sessions with key staff, usually customer-facing staff, because customer-facing staff are the ones that are best at interpreting customer behavior. I'm a little bit worried when people go like, oh, we'll have only voice of the customer, because when you're asking the customer to justify a decision, he's using a part of the brain that doesn't have the capability for language. You're basically getting a made up answer. But if you have people that interact with the customer, they can observe behavior, which is much more reliable than just a voiced opinion. After you've got everybody's input, you know what resonates, what doesn't resonate. You talk to your top salespeople, see what they're doing. Remember at Showpad, we did scaling sales excellence. We talked to the top guys. We gave that narrative to the new hires, and all of a sudden they came to the same level as the top guys. So that's the kind of thing that you're doing. But instead of with a sales conversation, you're doing with like a whole strategic narrative. You follow that up with some desk research. You want to know what the competition is saying. I don't want to go too far into the competition because copy paste is not a strategy, but you need to understand like what are they doing. I do some keyword analysis on their websites. Sometimes I hijack their keywords if possible. It's always a lot of fun, drives them nuts. Another thing we did is like, you group a number of features into something, and these are features that already exist. You group them into something new, give it a name and market that. It drives them up the wall. But we invented that. Yeah, but you didn't name it, So you do all this research to see what the customer is doing and what the competition is up to. A really valuable information point is new customers. So people that haven't used the product yet, they've just signed and they're being onboarded. And at the beginning of the onboarding, if you could talk to them then, you'll be getting a lot of information because they're basing their opinion only on what the company has said about itself. So only on the de facto messaging that it's been using. It hasn't been changed by product usage or interaction with key staff or customer success. Like it's just like, okay, we've signed. Now tell us why you've signed. And if they're fresh enough, you'll get really good insights. And then you work on a shared deliverable. So it's very important to document this work and to keep that in a central document where people can come in and have opinions. And it's a living thing. It's never really done, but you need something that you can co-create on. And that takes about, 2-3 months, easy. After which, once you've got the methodology straight, there's a whole methodology behind it. It's based on brain science, but I won't go into too much detail. Once the staff has gotten that on board, they can take over and basically do the next iterations. Because as you know, messaging is a moving target, right? Markets change, products change. Every quarter or every 6 months, you need to revisit this and say, does this still make sense?
I always enjoy talking to you, Pete, because I feel like we can spend 2 hours talking about the subject and going fairly deep. But I just keep reflecting back to my own experience in the role, right? Both at like Revenate, Showpad, and Salesforce, and then thinking about it with Presales Collective and figuring how messaging just continues to change over time and how Presales is this knowledge hub that is just in this unique position that's hearing front of the house, back of the house. And I think the best organizations have a great mechanism where the marketing team and the product marketing team is reaching out to the pre-sales team. They're reaching out to the sales team. They're continuing to iterate. And the best sales engineers know what's working. You can go to any organization and you ask somebody like, oh, what's so-and-so doing that makes them so special? And they have a regurgitated message every time. They know what works. And I reflect back to my own experience with Showpad, right? Because I always feel like we were ahead of the game. We've been talking about buyer journey, buyer enablement since like 2015, 2016, which is awesome to see. But I used to have my messaging and story based off who I was talking to. If I was talking to the marketing admin, I had my specific messaging. If I was talking to the sales executive, I had my specific messaging. Maybe sometimes it was a little off base, but sometimes it really resonated and I got to see that light bulb moment. But making an organization where feedback is appreciated and continually rolled out to cut through the noise and keep everyone, like you said, marching on the same beat, it is really important. So I like your examples there.
I think you put your finger on something really important there. And that is that pre-sales is at the table when the customer is making the synaptic jump and coming to a conclusion. Marketing isn't in the room. sales often isn't in the room, but I can guarantee you that pre-sales is at the table when something resonates and they see it and they know that it resonates. And all of a sudden that goes into their inventory of things to use for the next customer. So I think if you can have a lot of customer facing staff and pre-sales in particular around the table when you're talking messaging, you'll probably get the best input.
Pete, we're coming up on time. I do have to ask, what does Yamazoni mean?
I'm based in Belgium and Flanders, and it's a Flemish expression. So the Belgians are a little bit passive aggressive, as we discussed years ago over cocktails at one point. So they won't honk in traffic, right? They won't explode in your face. They won't shout at you, but they'll kind of mutter under their breath. They'll go like, you can't do it like that. And that's the expression. Yamazoni is like, you can't do it like that. So the reason why I use it is I don't do things the way other marketing companies do them. I don't use the existing methodologies. I don't start with why. I have my own way of doing things and it works really well. So I'm a bit of a rebel. So Yamazoni is that.
I love that. What's one piece of advice you would like to give our audience today?
I think the most important piece of advice would be to create and curate your messaging. So you need to put in the work. Your messaging is as important, if not more so, than your brand, because it does the heavy lifting. You have to revisit it often. It's okay to have a strong opinion. Don't regurgitate. Don't copy paste. Make sure that you maintain that as an asset, right? Your messaging is an asset. So get people involved. You'll notice that people love to contribute to this. These are really popular projects and people go like, oh, finally somebody's listening to me, right? And if that gets rolled into the general messaging, that's really super. You're creating superheroes. If you do that consistently and you curate your messaging, you're going to close more business. It makes sense, right? If marketing engages its audience better, if sales converts prospects or convinces prospects more, and if customer success can retain customers more, then you've got pre-sales as this kingpin that basically aligns to that whole narrative. And you'll make their job easier because instead of having to undo some of the stuff that sales and marketing has said, they'll basically reiterate that and make you more credible as a company.
Pete, I really appreciate your time today. I appreciate all the insight you've given me over the years when it comes to messaging. I feel like I've become fairly obsessed with messaging.
Join the club.
I know it's been a lot of learnings, right? And this is also why I want to have you on the podcast so that our audience could understand how important it is to their day-to-day job as solutions engineers. Pete, thanks for the time today. Really appreciate it. And we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun.
All right, Presales Collective. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. It's always fun talking about messaging and marketing with product marketing folks. Obviously, Pete and I go back. We've worked together. I've always appreciated his technical sales background prior to getting into marketing and product marketing. As I talked about in the podcast today, I felt like my role was really part product marketing at Showpad. I think being new to the market with a tool and a technology that was still trying to gain traction, really, and to help build a category around sales enablement. 2014, 15, 16, it really just wasn't well known. And trying to figure out what was working, what wasn't working, I thought was a very important part of my job as a sales engineer, right? Capturing what was marketing saying behind the scenes, what was sales saying to the customers, and really figuring out that middle ground. And then as a leader, making sure what was resonating with our audiences was brought to all of our individuals, and we would have conversations about what was working, what was not working, and then be able to funnel that back to sales and to marketing to continue to make the changes. I alluded to some things that really happen behind the scenes here at Presales Collective about how we're looking at messaging as it relates to the profession. This is a big, big aspirational goal of ours, is to continue to align the profession on some similarities as it relates to the role. I've said this in today's episode, I've been very open about this, is the role and the title might not matter in your day-to-day, but it does matter when you're building a pipeline and bringing awareness to this profession and making people more aware of it. And so just trying to streamline and have some alliance on what great looks like is an important initiative of the Presales Collective. I would be lying if I haven't said that we have spent hours and hours and hours on messaging and reevaluating our messaging as it relates to the pre-sales community. Because with Presales Collective, we also have Presales Academy. So we have folks that are aspiring to be in this profession. We have people that are early stage veterans, people who've been here in this profession for 40 years. And so how do we make sure that we as a global community are serving our members, serving the profession, and really having alignment so that we can continue to raise awareness to the best job that no one's ever heard of. So I hope you liked today's episode. If you have any feedback or any thoughts, please reach out to me on Slack. I am going to ask a favor that you do rate our podcast, whether it's Spotify, Apple, or your favorite podcasting. Help us continue to get the word out. It's been amazing to see this podcast just grow and continue to resonate with the pre-sales profession. And so we want to make sure other folks who are in this profession can be made aware of this podcast and the amazing stories of the folks that we're highlighting here on this medium. All right, Pre-Sales Collective, that's enough of me. I will see you next week.